The topic tonight is a very topical issue, the question of abortion. If we have time, also birth control, and if not, we'll somehow compensate for that next time. It's a given for anybody that knows the foundations of the Torah, Yiddishkeit, that we believe in the sanctity of life. That life is holy in its own right, not as a means to an end, but in itself. And I can't say absolute because there are certain limitations, real exceptions, when a person is meant to give up their life for certain principles. And mainly there are three categories of actions that the Torah tells us, and the Talmud expounds, that supersede life itself. We have to give up our life rather than violate those precepts. And generally they are classified as avodah zarah, idol worship, betraying our religion. The Jewish people went to their death when they were forced, when they were told either to convert to Christianity, for example, to other religions, or to die, and they chose death because that's one of the three cardinal laws. The other one is called Gilu Arayos, which is the very severe prohibited sexual prohibitions we spoke about in some of the lectures, incest, adultery, and such. And the last one is murder, that we cannot kill a life to save our life. It doesn't mean that we can't kill for self-defense. Self-defense is something which is mandated, but it means that, we shouldn't feel that our life is more precious than somebody else's life. We are told either you kill an innocent person or we're going to kill you. We're not allowed to kill the other person even to save our life. And the question which we'll talk about today, what is the status of an unborn life, of a child which was not born yet, was conceived, and it's inside the uterus of his mother, but the child wasn't born yet. And we know that there is in the modern world, there is a battle between the two factors, for and against abortion, called pro-life and pro-choice. And we live in a world of advocacy. Advocacy means that it's not about the truth, it's about who is stronger, which side has a greater facility to be able to fight its cause. And this applies, unfortunately, to every part of life, even to the justice system we live in. Today, sometimes in courts, it's not the one who is right is going to win in court, it's the one who has a better legal system, who has better infrastructure of defense and so on and so forth. And the same thing applies to many questions of morality. It's not a question of who is right, who is wrong, it's a question of which group is more aggressive in trying to fight for its cause. And we have those two causes called pro-life and pro-choice. Pro-choice is vehemently opposed to any form of limitations, and pro-life is vehemently opposed to anything, to any kind of ability to be able to abort a child. The Torah is not about advocacy. The Torah is about the truth. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, Torah is the only truth that we have. There's no other truth in this world. There are many other philosophies and many other ways of looking at life that have elements of truth, but they all come from Torah. If there's anything true in any other isms, any other systems, they come from the Torah. And when we're talking about those two factions, for pro-choice and pro-life, the Torah is not about extremes. It puts everything in perspective. And this perspective will try to sum up. All of these lessons are not meant to go to, because the Torah is infinitely deep and complex, and there's so much that is on to talk about every subject. But we want to give at least a general overview of the issues involved. Now, we know that recently in Australia there was a change of legislation, and again, it was under a lot of pressure from the pro-choice group that they have decided and they've pushed through a legislation, and under pressure the government has allowed for this to happen, that any mother at any point of pregnancy, she could be 9 months pregnant, she could decide for whatever reason, that she changed her mind, for reasons such as she wants to be able to travel, she wants to be able to have more freedom, more time, and she can abort a child for any reason at all, as long as the child wasn't born yet. The child is completely formed, it's basically a complete human being, that just the only difference is it's still inside the uterus, and it hasn't entered the big wide world. But nevertheless, it became permitted. And we know that in ancient cultures, this particular complete ability to be able to dispose of unborn children also led to be able to kill born children too. For example, in certain cultures, in ancient cultures, they were able to morally, even though they had certain moral codes, but they believed that up to a certain age, you're allowed to be able to kill a child for whatever reason. Because they naturally, it progressed. If you can do it before the child is born, when the child already has a complete form and formed it's virtually a complete human being, then why can't you do it very, very soon, in very close proximity to the child's birth? The same thing we'll talk about when we'll discuss euthanasia, the concept of mercy killing, that you can kill people at when they're very sick. And this, in many cultures, it progressed into being able to kill an elderly person because they felt his life was useless, so that they felt no problems in doing that. So what is the definition of a unborn child in Jewish law? And this is very interesting because on one hand, there's no question that it is life, it's a living being, but at the same time, it's not an equal being. The Torah definitely does distinguish between a human being that's already born and an unborn child. And there's many examples in the Talmud where we see that while indiscriminately to destroy an unborn life, it's an element of murder. It definitely has an element of murder in it, but at the same time, it's definitely not the same as killing a born human being. And one of the clearest ways to see it, the most distinct ways to see it, is the fact that there's a clear distinction between the mother's life and the life of the unborn child. In English, they like to call different progressions unborn. In the very early stage of after the conception, it's called embryo, and later it's called fetus. I specifically don't like to use the word fetus because fetus is a very derogatory term, almost something which is very putrid and something, to be able to portray it as something that is not connected to life. So I'd rather call it an unborn child. So how do we see that it's not an equal life? Because in Jewish law, as opposed to some other religions, while before the child is born, the mother's life always takes precedence. So if you have a situation that we have to choose between saving the mother or saving the unborn child, the Jewish law is unequivocal that we must save the mother. Like I said before, there are some religions that even before the child is born, it's considered an equal life and they would never save the mother. But in Jewish religion, that's a fact. And we see it in the Mishnah. Last week we spoke about it, the very first formation of oral law, not formation, but the very first printing or putting together the oral law was the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, in the very last part, which talks about certain levels of purity and impurity, it says like this: Isha shehi makshe leilet, a woman who cannot give birth. In olden times, it was much more common. Today, it still happens that there is a conflict, and I'll talk about it in some of the cases that I had. But in olden times, it happened much more often that a woman basically could not give birth, the child wouldn't come out, and they didn't always have the tools. Caesarean birth existed many, many years ago, but not always they were able to do it. And sometimes you have to choose between the two lives. And the Mishnah says, you have to cut down the unborn child inside her uterus. You can take it out piece by piece. Because her life supersedes the life of the unborn child. As soon as the head comes out, it's either the head or most of the body. Usually the child comes out head first, but sometimes not. But either way, when the head comes out for sure, it's called the born child. Ein neugim boy, you cannot anymore destroy his life to save the mother. She'ein doichen nefesh mipnei nefesh, because one cannot destroy a life to save another life. So from this Mishnah we clearly can see that even though it's definitely life, but it's not equal life. And therefore, when it comes to saving the mother, the child is called a roidef. Roidef means a pesua, an unborn child, I mean. There is a concept in Jewish law when you see a person running with a knife trying to kill another person, you can actually kill. That's, I think, one of the only cases in Jewish law when you can actually kill somebody before he committed the crime. And it's not obviously self-defense also, but over here it's not self-defense, it's protecting somebody else. But that's called a roidef, a pesua. And in this case, one of the legal terms that this unborn child is a pesua. He is basically threatening, in a very real sense, the life of the mother. Once he's born, it's a different story, because he's not doing it out of malice anymore, and therefore he's not called a pesua anymore, and therefore you cannot destroy the child once he is born. Now, this is the simplest allowance for abortion. When it's a clear situation, when the child threatens in a very real sense the mother's life. There are less obvious cases, and I'll give you one example that happened recently with me. I received a phone call from a very prominent doctor, a religious doctor in New York, called Dr. Rosen, who was looking after a young lady who was 20-something weeks pregnant. Now she already was more than halfway through her pregnancy, and she developed a very rare condition when the placenta begins to grow. The cells begin to multiply. It's not cancerous, it's still benign, but it has an effect, takes over the body. And the only way to be able to save the mother's life, because if you wait, it's in a very real sense, it endangers the mother's life, is to be able to destroy the unborn child. Unfortunately, in her case, he also had to do a hysterectomy. You had to take out her uterus at the same time, because the placenta was already attached to the uterus, and so you couldn't save the uterus. And the doctor, will explain later that why, when it comes to questions of abortion, the rabbi is always asked. And I want to be able to preface this lecture as any other lecture that I'm giving, any other talk, that this is not the cases which we give and the halachic positions that we put forward are not meant to be used in practice, because every case is to be taken individually. You can never take a general idea and say, okay, now we're going to apply it ourselves, because we are oversimplifying everything over here. We're giving general issues. It's impossible to be able to cover it in one lecture, and therefore, whenever and the questions of abortion come up very often, but they always are asked individually by the people involved. In a religious community, the couple always will ask a rabbi who specializes in these topics before they make such a decision. That shows you how precious the concept of even unborn life is to us. So when I received this call from a doctor, I told them that they must perform the operation immediately. They can't even wait a day, because I know this particular condition. And I know that it could be every day counts, every hour counts. And I spoke afterwards to the couple, and I told them that, look, they're actually very lucky because they already have 3 children. So even though she'll never be able to have children again, but in this case, we would have to save the mother's life no matter what, even if she can't have any more children in the future. But in this case, even if she wouldn't have any more children in the past, but in this case, they were quite lucky because they wouldn't be childless, and the operation was performed. And that's a typical example where we save the mother's life. And we're not only allowed to, but we are obligated to perform an abortion. But there are much, much less obvious cases. We're talking about subtle cases. What do you call danger? And then we have to be able to, number one, define the different opinions. What is the prohibition of abortion? And there are 3 different opinions about it. At least, I'm going to simplify it. The first opinion is the opinion of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a great halachist who lived he passed away in 1986. And he posited that abortion is an element of murder. He also didn't say it was an actual murder, because then you wouldn't be able to even save the mother's life if it's like equal life. But he said it's an element of murder. In other words, it's a very, very severe prohibition. Other opinions talk about the concept of ashchosas zera, of destroying the seed. We know that even masturbation is forbidden in Jewish law. We'll discuss it later to what it means exactly. But we're not allowed to waste seed because it is potential life. So there are opinions that a unborn child is potential life, and therefore it's even though it's no murder, but it's also is a serious transgression. And the third opinion that it's physical harm, and certain proofs are brought from both the written Torah and the oral Torah that one is inflicting physical harm. So when we weigh all of these opinions together, there are a number of gray area cases that come up, and we weigh a number of factors. Number one, the severity of illness. Obviously, I gave you a very extreme case when there was no question that the life of the mother was in danger. But sometimes there are much less extreme cases. For example, when the woman suffers depression, it's possible that sometimes pregnancy and birth could make it much worse. She could, go into postnatal depression and stuff like that. But it's not always a very clear and defined definition of threat to life, even though I believe that mental illnesses are very serious. But nevertheless, it's not as crucial as an immediate death of the mother if you will continue with the pregnancy and birth. Another question is, at what stage of pregnancy we're talking about? In Jewish law, there are a couple of stages of severity. The least severe one is before 40 days. Again, I'm not saying that before 40 days is permitted indiscriminately to be able to facilitate an abortion, but the most possible and the easiest decision to make is when the embryo is under 40 days. And by the way, whenever we talk about days and months, there's a very clear discrepancy between what a doctor is saying and reality. Doctors speak in different language. Whenever they say, for example, somebody is 8 weeks pregnant, in reality they're only about 6 weeks pregnant, because doctors always count from beginning of the period, and we know that it's impossible to get pregnant at that time. So when we talk to couples, obviously we speak their language because that's what they hear from doctors. But when the Jewish law says 40 days, in medical terms, they will call it probably 2 weeks later, because they would already say that the child is probably 52 days pregnant, when according to Jewish law, they're 40 days pregnant because they actually conceived 40 days. So it's a little bit different. But until 40 days, there's no form to the embryo, fetus, whatever you want to call it at that particular stage. It's called in the Talmud Maya Ba'alma. It's almost like just one sack of water. That's what it is. There's no formation of anything at that particular point. So in a situation where there is a possible danger to life, if the rabbi would give permission, that would be the easiest time to do it, under 40 days. The next period is considered until 3 months, because after 3 months it's already considered that it's already nikar ha'ubar. It's already not only everything is formed, but there's also a very, you can already recognize the fact that woman is pregnant. And there's many halachic parameters to do with pregnancy connected with 3 months. For that reason, for example, after divorce, one has to wait for 3 months and so on and so forth for that reason, because that's when you can distinguish at which point she became pregnant. And the third one is from 3 months until 7 months. And that's where it becomes much, much more difficult to give a permission to be able to abort than until 3 months. And finally, from 7 months until birth. Over there, it's probably the only way one can give permission is if there's a real, tangible and certain danger to mother's life. So those are the 4 parameters of the times. Now, again, when we're talking about levels of danger, we also discuss over here potential defects of that you might find, in an unborn child. And again, the defects would determine a number of issues when you would consider an abortion. Number one, is it compatible with life? Will the child be able to live? What effect it will have on the mother? And at what stage of pregnancy. So all of these three things you would look into. So I'll give you a couple of interesting cases. I recall that it was quite a number of years ago, probably by now 10 years ago approximately. I was traveling back from the States. I was coming back to Australia. It was after a conference. They have this yearly conference of all the emissaries. And I received right away an urgent message from a rabbi in New York to call him. He said it's a question of life and death, that's how I put it. So I called him up and he says to me, look, we have the following situation. I have a couple in my community. The couple had a child who suffered, there was some kind of a recessive gene, incompatible recessive gene, which we spoke about either last week or the week before. And they had a daughter afflicted with this particular genetic disease, and the daughter is 7 years old, but she is like a girl who is a few months old. Like she's totally incapable of any kind of independent behavior. She's totally almost like a newborn child who was not incapacitated. And the couple was given the advice that they should. I apologize. I think she was only 3 years old, but they said she was like a 7 months old. That's what they said. And the doctors advised the couple only to have children through IVF PGD, if you remember from last lecture. In other words, to be able to make sure that the next child will not be afflicted with this disease. And they went on birth control. One thing everybody has to know, there's no such a thing as a perfect birth control. If the Eibishter Hashem wants, people can get pregnant. There's no question about it. And they got pregnant, even though they were on birth control. They were actually on a hormonal pill. I don't know if the pill didn't work. The pill sometimes doesn't work, or she forgot to take it, but she became pregnant. So right away she panicked, and they right away went to the rabbi, the one who called me, and they said to him, look, we would like to do an abortion before 40 days. There's a very high chance that the child will be very, very severely ill, and would like to abort the child if they knew about the 40 days, that it's much, much easier. So the rabbi called me up. I was traveling. So in the meantime, he called two other rabbis, one of them in America and one in Israel. The one in America told him out of the question not to abort. And the one in Israel told him, no problem, you can abort. Under 40 days, you can do it. So I asked him, why are you calling me? You already asked them. I don't like to give answers once other rabbis were asked. So he said, look, I specifically asked the opinion. I didn't ask for the ruling because I wanted to hear from you. So I said to him, I want to be able to think about it. What do I want to think about? From what he told me, that they were so traumatized by the whole situation with the older daughter and everything else, that they will find a way to get some rabbi to answer. They'll shop around until they get an answer to let them do the abortion. What I was thinking to myself, two things. One thing that I find is that as much as a couple may feel at a time that they want to perform an abortion, many times it comes to haunt them. And I've seen it time and time again. Many times they will live with this forever. I know about one particular woman that she made a choice to make an abortion. She didn't ask anybody. She wasn't religious at the time. And every time she looks at a child, she thinks, how old would my child be if I would let the child live? And therefore, it's, even though at a time it seems like people feel that they have to, that's the choice they have to make, and they panic because whatever situation they have, but sometimes it becomes a real trauma that follows them throughout their life. And therefore, in this particular case, they didn't know the child would be affected. And they may always think, what if? So I thought of the following idea, and it's something which I didn't want to take the responsibility when it comes to, as you already know from before, I always like to share the responsibility with everything. Over here we're talking about life. So I thought of the following concept. What if we will tell them to wait, not to do an abortion now, and to be able to do a test. There is a test that you can do to check the genetic, for any chromosomal or genetic defects at approximately 30 weeks. I think now you can do it already 11 weeks, since you can do it sooner. But that was my thought. And I thought to myself, I know that it's a much, much greater prohibition to abort the child later on, but at the same time, maybe we're giving the child a chance to live. If they will find out the child is unaffected, then the child will live. And if we do it earlier, we'll never know. So I said that idea to the rabbi, and he says to me, yeah, but they will only agree to do it if you will tell them in advance that if they will find the child is defected, you will give them a permission to abort. I said, okay, leave it with me. I'm going to try to do it. So I called up a very prominent posek, halachic authority, who at the time was the chief rabbi of Israel. His name is Rav Amar. He came to visit us twice in Australia. And I gave him a call, and I said to him, look, I have the following, and this was, by the way, it was right before, by the time it already came to that point, it was already very close to 40 days, and the couple was panicking, and they wanted to take any opinion that will tell them to abort. So they literally were planning to go to the abortion clinic that day. So Rav Amar told me, when I told him my whole train of thought, how on one hand to risk a greater prohibition connected with abortion on one hand, on the other hand, at least we'll know that we gave the child the chance to live, otherwise we'll never know. So Rav Amar said to me like this, he said to me, look, I'm really going into a meeting right now, it's a very important meeting, and I have to think straight, it's a question of life and death. Why don't you call, there's another colleague that he has, also a very prominent halachic authority that I'm also very close with, called Rav Baron. Give him a call and tell him your train of thought. If he will agree with you, I'll agree with the two of you. And we'll make together like a basin, like three of us, and we'll make a psak together. So I called Rav Baron, and I said to him, look, this is my thought what to do. So he says to me, give me 24 hours. I said, look, unfortunately, we don't have 24 hours. We have maybe a couple of us because they're planning to go to the clinic. He said, give me 1 hour. And in 1 hour, I spoke to him and he says, I will agree with you, and together with Rav Amar and yourself, we'll make this psak. And we ruled for them to wait. And they were actually very happy because they also felt they wanted to have a clarity of what's happening. They would feel much better if they would know that they're not destroying a healthy child. And about 3 weeks later, she had a miscarriage through nothing what she has done herself. She just happened to have a miscarriage. And they felt much relieved because of it, because it was more like a hand of God rather than them doing something which they will always maybe think about in the future. So that was an example of how they avoided doing something themselves, and obviously was meant to happen because the miscarriage occurred without any interference on their part. Can you show it? The other case I want to discuss with you is a case of very, very severe defects which are not compatible with life. And there's two defects which are dealt with called Trisomy 13 and 18. When you get to like Trisomy 21, it's Down syndrome. Down syndrome is a child, there's some beautiful children that live with Down syndrome, and there's no real excuse to be able to abort a child because of that. We're not here to be able to decide which life is more precious to in the eyes of God because somebody is deemed to be more intellectually developed than somebody else. So that's not what it's all about. But sometimes there's a question of there's no compatibility with life. And Trisomy 13 and 18 are very, very severe deformations. that the child will live, sometimes a child will die at birth, sometimes they will live 1 week, 10 days, 2 weeks. If they really try to interfere and stop the child from dying, the child can live, I think the record is maybe up to 1 year. But that's highly, highly unusual. Usually it's a question of weeks. So I dealt with a number of cases of trisomies. And over there, I took into account the mother's state of mind. Again, we're dealing over here with something which is completely not compatible with life. So it's not a question of child going to live. But again, it also doesn't mean that you're allowed to abort the child indiscriminately. So I'll compare 2 cases that I had. I had more than 2 cases, but I'll give you an example of how we looked at 2 different cases. One case, I received a call from a couple, a rabbi in the Rebbetzin, the Lubavitch emissary, somewhere in a very, very faraway place, and she was 20-something weeks pregnant, and the child was diagnosed with trisomy 13. When I was talking to her, I could see that she's falling apart. It wasn't just a question that she was traumatized by it. I could see that if she would be told that she has to go with the pregnancy and to go through with birth of the child for another 17 weeks, she maybe will have a nervous breakdown. And in that case, I did speak to another prominent person who agreed with me to allow her to have an abortion. Again, it was completely confirmed. There was a number of tests done. It wasn't in any way disputable, and we'll let her have an abortion because of that particular case. Another case, which was a few months later in California, also a religious family, she didn't even call me up to ask me for an abortion. She was totally okay with continuing with the pregnancy to birth, and she was more concerned about what level of intervention has to be made. We'll talk in another session about questions of sanctity of life as far as medical ethics and saving a patient at the end of life, for example. To what extent you have to interfere. A person is terminally ill and is suffering. What interventions we have to make, what life sustenance and life necessities we have to give to them, and which ones we don't. So the same thing applied over here. She was asking basically the question, once a child is born, to what extent we have to really push for him to live longer, and to what extent we have to give him the necessities and let life take its course. And I've assisted her in that. We didn't even discuss abortion because that wasn't a question. And there's certainly the only way that you can allow an abortion at that particular time after 20-something weeks is only if you see that it's a real danger to the mother's well-being, and mental well-being is as serious as physical well-being. So I want to share another story with you to give you a spectrum of, many times I do get a call from couples that inadvertently became pregnant. They tried not to. And they feel psychologically it's difficult for them. They feel that it's going to be very, very hard for them to raise another child. So I remember very distinctly one particular story. I was, it was Pesach, I remember clearly. I went out to the zoo with my family. It was Chol Hamoed. It was the intermediary days when you're allowed to go out. And I get a call from a religious couple from New York. And she says to me, look, we have 6 children. I couldn't see myself. They're pretty close together. They're not, and I found very, very hard, difficult for me to raise them. And I became pregnant with the 7th child. Again, she didn't want to become pregnant, but it happens. It's something that ultimately the Talmud says that we are not born by choice and we don't die by choice. It's life is predestined by God Almighty. And I must tell you that as much as I do believe in the concept of the well-being of the mother, and I take it very seriously, and there's no question that in that case she would be allowed by Jewish law to continue indefinitely with birth control. But it's very difficult for me to be able to allow or to even to imagine abortion at this point for that reason, even under 40 days. I'll explain to you why. I deal with all spectrum of couples. The couples who are asking me for the best birth control methods, which we'll discuss later. Why do they ask a rabbi? Because the Torah has a lot to say about birth control also. And they ask me for if it's right to have birth to for how long to take a break. And there are couples who say, look, they want to close shop, they had enough, they already had, enough kids and so on and so forth, and that's many times justified. But then you have couples who are suffering from infertility, and they will do anything at all to be able to adopt a child. It's very difficult in this day and age to adopt children. And they would give the child the best life. They would do everything. I have parents who become the future mother becomes pregnant with a child, and the child is totally healthy, and I'm telling her, why don't you give the child for adoption? And she tells me, well, how could a mother give a child for adoption? When you think about it, how can a mother take away from the child the possibility to have a life? So I always tell them to put it in perspective. I know it's very difficult. Sometimes they can't, think about it. How can how can a mother do it to a child? But on the other hand, what would the child be happier with once a child has a loving parents that adopted him? To have a life or to lose the ability to have a life? And that's why it's very, very difficult when we're talking about a healthy child, just to be able to say, again, if it's a question of life and death, if many times the mother has had cancer and pregnancy will rekindle, she'll go out of remission again. It's certain cancers are extremely, extremely aggressive, and a pregnancy can bring them up. There's no question that in such a case you would have to abort a child if we're talking about a life of a mother and a very tangible possibility of her losing a life. I'm not discussing it. I'm talking about when you have a physically healthy mother, a healthy embryo, or as they call it, a fetus, unborn child, whatever they want to call it. And we have over here many couples that would pay for this young, or you have a single girl who becomes pregnant, and for her it's difficult. She doesn't want your parents to know about it. She doesn't want, it's socially difficult for her. I tell her they'll pay for you to go away to some kind of a resort. Nobody will know you're pregnant. You will have the child, and they will give the child the best life, and talk about wonderful, wonderful parents. So I was talking to this couple who's telling me that she's pregnant with number 7, and she says it's very, very difficult for her to raise another child. It wasn't dangerous for her to be pregnant. It was all about raising the child. It's also a very big difference. Sometimes people can have a terrible, terrible mental disease, and even the pregnancy will exasperate it, and sometimes it's raising the child. So I said to her in the most sensitive and a gentle way, I said to her, look, I agree with you that I can understand why you didn't want to have this child, but now God, for whatever reason, made you pregnant. Obviously, it wasn't your doing, it was from above. If you really feel that you can't raise the child, why don't you give the child up for adoption? I'll organize it for you. I have beautiful, beautiful couples that are waiting to raise a child. So she told me the same thing that everybody says. How could a mother give a child for adoption? So I explained to her, I said, you're going to live with it, right? At least you're giving your child a life, and you will live with the knowledge that you're giving your child a beautiful life. Otherwise, you will live with the knowledge that you didn't give that child a chance to live. So she says, let me think about it. Anyway, at the end of the day, she decided to go through with the pregnancy and birth, and she called. I still remember the day when she called me up to let me know that today was the bris of the child. She showed me what they named the child, and she thanked me for convincing her. She says she loves the child she loves the child dearly, and the only thing she asked me was that to give permission never to become pregnant again, and to advise her on the best halachically advisable way and medically advisable way to be able to make sure it happens. But I always feel that when you have such a situation, nobody regrets it ultimately in such a case. And we have many, many such cases. Just yesterday, I spoke to a couple from Northern America with exactly the same thing, and I recall very clearly how a few years ago, a Rebbetzin from Buffalo called me up, and she told me that one of the alumni, she looks after a campus, one of the alumni, girls who went through campus over there, is now living somewhere else, and she's in depression, and she wants to be able to abort the child. And she said, can I give them your number? And they spoke to me again. I don't go with harshness and tell them, it's forbidden, because you have to think about also, you have to judge exactly what they're holding. But I spoke to them, I spoke to the family, I spoke to the parents on both sides to give as much support as possible. And today the child is turning 1 next week, and they're still in touch with me. And she called me today just to thank me for the fact that they have this beautiful child. So we see over here a very big spectrum of cases. It's not black and white. The rabbi who is asked the question has to always remember he's dealing with a life. It's not a simple question of, any question is important, but especially when it comes to questions of life. We also have to remember that there's many other questions that come up, questions of embryo reductions. Doctors sometimes, as soon as somebody gets becomes pregnant with twins or especially triplets, they think it's the end of the world. You must do embryo reduction. You must reduce the number of embryos, and we know that it's in the vast majority of cases they will have a healthy child. I had a couple from Europe that traveled to New York to have fertility treatment, because in Europe they didn't have proper infrastructure in that particular country where they lived to have the rabbinic supervision. What I spoke to you about, how our fertility treatments have proper infrastructure. So she went to Cornell. The couple went to Cornell because it's under my personal supervision, and they wanted me to. They wanted to go to that facility, and I recommended a doctor. Dr. Goldschlag is a famous doctor. He looked after them, and it was a miracle. They put in 1 embryo, and she's pregnant with triplets. So it's a different story how it happened. From 1 embryo, ended up with triplets. So they called me up and said, Dr. Goldschlag said, you must have an embryo reduction. You must take away the embryo. So they asked me what to do. I said to them, I'm usually don't like to argue with doctors, but I told them under no circumstances. I mean, they didn't mind having triplets. He just scared them that it'll be complications and everything else. I said to them, look, you can have complications with any pregnancy. But I told them, don't play around with it. You can do a reduction and you can lose all 3 of them. So they went back to the doctor and they said, Rabbi Ulman said no. He said, I'm not going to argue. Rabbi Ulman, he doesn't, I'm very friendly with him. And he says, if he said it, I told them, you will see once that they'll be born, you look at them and you'll think which one was I going to take out. And exactly what happened. They sent me a picture of all 3 of them. I actually organized for a moil to fly to the country to do a bris. And it was very healthy triplets. And she said that's exactly what she was thinking about, looking at them, which one would I decide to take out, from the 3 of them. We also have to remember that many times the doctors give, they make the couple panic from the tests which they do. When I was in New York now in February, I get a call from a lady in Manhattan, and she says that we took a ultrasound and it came out with an enlarged kidney. So I said to her that, again, I'm not a doctor, but anybody who deals with those questions knows that when you have a lot of different signs, that's a red light for some deformity. But when you have only one of them, it's so common that it's nothing, but doctors are afraid to be sued, so they always give you the worst case scenario. Because they're worried that that later on the blame, why didn't you tell us? And again, she told me this in February when I was in New York, and just last week she gave birth to a healthy child, and everything was fine. So again, not every single time when the doctors scare the couple of any kind of a physical deformity, it means that something bad is going to happen. Many, many times they'll see a lot of blessings, and doctors sometimes they do give the worst case scenario. So from this presentation, I haven't touched up on birth control. I want to leave some time for questions, but we see over here how on one hand it's a very complex topic, because on one hand we do talk about life, but at the same time it's in perspective. We have to know and put the whole picture into this particular perspective. We have to see exactly in which situation do we say that there's no question abortion is mandated because the life of the mother is in real danger, and when it's something which is only in the realm of a very, very far possibility, and the pregnancy is already quite advanced. And one thing is for sure, that this concept that unfortunately became legislated here in New South Wales, that you can take a human being, and that the only difference between that human being and the one that you can see is that one is still inside and one is out, and you can abort this human being in 9 months, that definitely doesn't go in lines with the morality and ethics of Torah and Judaism, and it's something that is considered to be akin to murder. So, any questions?
Yeah. All right, question number 1. Is abortion a sin that can be forgiven? I heard in a lecture that this sin is karet and warranties a gilgul as an unborn child that will die in an abortion.
It's very difficult to say these things. Abortion is a sin, no question about it. I mean, again, depends when. Sometimes it's not only not a sin, sometimes it's a must in some of the cases. But to abort a child for no reason is a sin. We don't focus on the questions of punishments. There's a lot, if we're talking about the future, we have to avoid it, and we have to not just avoid it, we have to make sure it doesn't happen. But if it was done, we have to be able to find ways how to rectify things. Judaism believes that tshuva, that repentance, can rectify many, many wrongs. And there are, rather than focus on all the terrible things that would happen, we have to be able to show how we can enhance life and how we can somehow compensate for what we have done. And there are tikkunim and reparations given for that, which is not a time for this particular talk. It's more of a Kabbalistic discussion, but that's how I would answer it.
How do they manage Jewish abortions and adoptions in Chutz La'aretz? I.e., there are orphanages in Israel which handle these cases. Is there organizations in Australia which deal with these situations?
Abortions became very complicated around the whole world. It's very difficult to adopt a child. They put a lot of obstacles, and that's why I remember when I was in the Beth Din many years ago, we dealt with many adoptions and conversions of adoption. People were adopting children from South America, from Asia, from different parts of the world, and converting them and raising them as beautiful Jewish kids. But today, everybody opts for other fertility treatments like surrogacies and egg donors because it just became so complicated. To adopt a Jewish child is virtually, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's next to impossible. It's very, very difficult. That's why when I'm saying that, when you have these cases when, and I want to just say one interesting point. If you remember, those who came to my very first lecture, I spoke about, in the very end, a DNA test that I had, which is a complicated case of a religious Jewish young man who met a very nice Jewish girl, but there was a question on her status because her grandmother was adopted, and there was a question of proving that her grandmother's biological mother was Jewish. And I helped, at the end of the day, we certified her. It was a combination of a number of things, but we did come to the conclusion that the biological mother was Jewish. And it was a very inspirational story. What we found out was, and it was a part of investigation and everything else, that the great-grandmother who gave up the child for adoption to another Jewish family, she actually ended up in a hospital. She had a very severe psychiatric illness. In those days, what's very treatable today was untreatable in those days, and no way she was able to raise the child. So she had two choices. She could have aborted the child, or she could have given the child a chance to live. She gave the child up to a very loving, beautiful family, and as a result, you have 3 generations of a beautiful family that raised, children, grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And this young lady who is getting married now, she came from that great-grandmother. Can you imagine if she would have decided to abort the child just because she knew she can't raise the child? So today, it's complicated. If one adopts a non-Jewish child, the child has to be converted. And if one adopts a Jewish child, of course, it doesn't have to be converted. But it's not easy to find a way how to do it. It's complicated.
What about aborting for rape?
Again, aborting for rape, I can understand why it's sometimes very psychologically difficult to be able to raise a child. But again, once again, it's hard to give a black and white answer because we have to be able to describe circumstances in each individual case. I can envisage a possibility that under 40 days in such a case, one would be able to do it. But again, I would really encourage giving up the child for adoption in such a case.
Often young couples are having that have just been married wish to delay pregnancies for a variety of reasons and want to use contraception to prevent the pregnancy. The reasons would have nothing to do with health reasons. What should a rabbi advise?
I think, I would like to answer the question, but I would prefer to leave it for next time, because since I was asked a number of questions on birth control, I'd rather not split it up. So with your permission, I'll leave it for another session.
When adopting a Jewish child, would there be an issue of yichud when the child grows up between a parent and a child?
Yeah. I'll explain what the issue is. It's very interesting that I was asked a seeming paradox, a dichotomy in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's approach to adoption in the early years and in the later years. It seems to be that in his letters, going back to the 50s and perhaps the 60s, he was quite discouraging of adoptions in America, and he was discouraging couples from doing so. And in the later years, I saw myself with my own eyes how many times that I've advised couples to adopt. And I believe that it's not a change of position. I believe it's a change of reality of adoptions in America. What used to happen is that in the early years, the culture was such that they would completely hide from the child they were adopted, and they would be told that they're natural child of those parents. And there's many halachic problems with doing so. Apart from the, something which I wrote about, because I was asked many times about the question of how much do you tell a child about the past? If somebody was born from an egg donor, for example, do we tell the child that is born from an egg donor, or do we hide it from them? And I believe that it's something which is, apart from certain halachic issues, it's psychologically much more correct to be able to tell a child from young age about where they come from, because anything that will come as a surprise, anything will come which they find out later on in life comes as a shock to the system, and a lot of times unbalances the equilibrium and the mental state. We've seen it many times, and therefore I can see that, and in Europe there was always a concept of adopting an orphan, for example. There used to be in a shtetl, a neighbor would die, and the child would become an orphan, and you would take the orphan into your house. It happened all the time, and the child knew that he wasn't the biological child. He loved his adopted parents. They loved him, but at the same time, there are boundaries. In other words, there's certain laws to do with the fact that you are not a biological child. Laws of certain affection and so on and so forth that govern Jewish law, and that's something that is true. Somebody asked me that is that an issue? It is an issue, but it's not an issue if you know how to handle it, if you know how to handle it properly. And today, the reason why I think the Rebbe did become much more positive about adoptions, because the whole culture has changed, and they didn't demand anymore from people to hide the background, and that solved a lot of halachic problems.
What about the morning after pill? Is that considered to be an abortion?
Usually we allow it. We allow morning after pill because it's still in a very it's in conception itself. There's certain stages, and in this case we'll allow it. Right. I mean, if it's important, obviously, if there's a need for it. If people forgot to use contraception and they were allowed by law to use contraception and they forgot to use it, we'd usually allow a morning after pill. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Especially for everybody opened up the faces. I was able to see who I'm talking to, so that's always very good. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. God bless you and all the very best. Good night.